It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman. I have stopped over here at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art to sit down once again with Charles and Amanda Shepard to continue our art history lesson a little bit. So far, we've been doing Catholic art.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're ever going to veer away from that, but
there's so much.
There's things that we can learn from all kinds of different art.
Yeah, sure.
But what do we have today?
Well, this is an interesting artist today, Charles Le Brun. And as most of the artists we've talked about, you're right, they were Catholics. And as we've discussed them, as we've researched them, we've found different strengths of their faith as we come and go. We've tried to focus on those with pretty strong faiths, although we've encountered a few that were lacking, so
Sure.
we've kind of not included them. But Charles Le Brun did wonderful religious work, particularly early on, and then he had an opportunity that he just couldn't turn down, I think partly because he was ambitious and partly because he had an ego, but he had some training, by the way, from Poussin, who was the #1 French painter of the time. But when King Louis XIV came forth looking for an artist who would do his bidding, more or less,
Okay.
Create scenes, portraits, landscapes, things that would speak to greatness of the faith, greatness of Louis XIV and his families, Le Brun saw the opportunity as something he couldn't say no to. And interestingly enough, his teacher, Poussin, told him, I wouldn't do that. He said, I was asked, and I won't do it. He said, I'm not going to bow in my direction to the whim of this egomaniac. And that cost Poussin some commissions, and it certainly opened the door for Le Brun to become hugely famous. But when you read about what was he, how do you define him? He's a painter, he's an art theorist, he's an interior decorator. He becomes the director of several major art academies in France, and he's the court painter. And because he does everything that Louis XIV wants, Louis XIV named him the greatest French artist of all time, which you have to guess roiled the feathers of a few people who were pretty good painters, but weren't quite that tight with Louis XIV.
It pays who you know.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. And as Charles said, King Louis XIV was very proud of who he was as king, what he was creating at Versailles, his exploits in war, and he wanted to position himself in the lineage of French greatness and make France and Versailles the center of the world. And while I would have liked to have found that Versailles is full of wonderful depictions of the life of Christ, we find wonderful depictions of the life of King Louis and his predecessors and Greek gods and goddesses, so a lot of classical and pagan art as well.
Okay.
But Le Brun did create the altarpieces for the areas of worship at Versailles. As we know, European monarchs worshipped in their palaces because their kingship was very closely linked with divine kingship. There was almost no line between their stately lordship and the lordship of Jesus Christ. They answered to God alone, and the king's subjects answered to the king.
Okay.
And this was also when European monarchies were still very closely linked to Roman authority. So we don't know if King Louis XIV elevated himself higher than papal authority, but I think he came pretty close to it. And we see that in one of his most famous and also most strikingly gorgeous paintings. He, as Charles said, King Louis declared him the greatest French painter of all time. And that may not be very far off. This was high Renaissance, so very naturalistic, high realism, lots of volume to our figures.
Lots of drama.
Emotions. It was said that he was bored by portraits and landscapes and really liked complex compositions with lots going on and lots of figures sort of choreographed together. And this painting of King Louis XIV presenting his scepter and helmet to Jesus Christ is I think we can look at it with a little bit of a sense of humor today, but it was his attempt to show his subordination to Jesus Christ. But I think, ironically, he was actually placing him at the same level of Jesus Christ. I don't want to speak for him. Louis, if you're listening, I'm sorry.
Well, it kind of seems like, here's my helmet and my sword. Could you put them at the right-hand seat that you have?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of mine too, right? And
Now,
it feels that way.
Is this the St. Louis?
Oh, he's not. No, he's not a saint.
Okay.
No, I'm not aware that he's been declared a saint.
He never got elevated.
No, no. And this painting, for our listeners, I'll describe it. It shows it's sort of a narrow vertical composition. It shows Jesus wrapped in a white, sort of floating linen,
Which defies gravity.
Right. He's coming down from the heavens, and the heavens are sort of black and roiling clouds, very dramatic. Jesus is shown very muscular, very powerful, in a commanding pose with his right arm raised. He's holding a cross-shaped scepter, and all of the subjects below him, we have some angels, we have some humans, we have earthly kings. They're all sort of reeling in awe and fear. So I think that we're on the right track with how we're depicting the Lord. But then the most dominant figure in the painting is King Louis in his finery, handing his helmet and scepter to Jesus. And also in the painting is another French king, King Louis IX, I believe it was, and then another royal advisor who are looking up in awe of Jesus. And then there are some soldiers who've sort of fallen down. They've been struck down. They're surrounded by their armor and their shields and their gold and the spoils of earthly victory. Very dramatic painting, lots of action, emotion, and drama.
Right.
Well, and Louis XIV, and he gets a lot of our attention because Charles's ambitions are so tied to his. But Louis saw himself as the one individual who could solidify French society and raise it to international greatness by getting out of Paris and that whole environment where his palace and his life were part of many other things. I mean, Paris is a bigger item. Let's go to my dad's hunting lodge in Versailles and expand this into the most amazing, palace in the world, such that the world will look at me and understand how great I am. So this artist is charged in many ways with depicting episodes from all of this that will underscore, in case you didn't get the point while you're walking around, underscore you are in the greatest palace ever, and this is the greatest king ever, and France is going to rule the world artistically, hence the 2 academies that Charles Le Brun is picked to lead, picked to form, actually. And for an artist, you couldn't have a better patron than this if that's what you want to do, and he really did it very, very well. If it's a downside for that artist, and I don't know that Le Brun ever saw it, it was that was going to be your career. And there probably wasn't going to be a second act after that.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of his work is still at Versailles. There's work at the Louvre. There's work at the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon. And one of the paintings at the Louvre I want to shift to because it speaks to his focus on emotion and action in the painting. And this painting, The Sleep of Jesus, executed around 1672, shows Mary holding a very well-developed and portly infant Jesus. He's well-fed. So lots of fleshy, very bright, fleshy figuration of the infant Jesus. And he's sleeping in her arms, and she's shushing the admirers around this sleeping child. And they're not in the home of the actual infant Jesus. They are in a 17th century French home with a wood stove fire, brick fireplace, and they're wearing the clothing of 17th century French people. So we've talked about this before, how artists positioned in a certain time period would have painted, a lot of them painted historical figures in contemporary fashions. And in this painting also, each figure has a distinct emotional expression. So while he has all of the light on the sleeping infant Jesus, the secondary figure is Mary, who has the second most light on her face. And then the other figures are all subordinate to the two central figures. And he is a master of composition. Every figure occupies the perfect place in the field. Nothing is out of place. Every element that he's chosen to paint has just the right amount of light. The clothing is positioned in the most flattering way possible, and they're all posing in very flattering ways.
And technically speaking, he's at a perfect time art historically, because other artists we've talked about from earlier times, their work by the technical nature of the time is going to be more flat. They didn't know perspective yet. They were less confident with drama, with swirling fabrics. And this is sedate for him, but it's a very moving piece. And yet he's using all the bag of tricks he's learned. And I think it's because it's Mary and Jesus, he's calmed down the turbulence that you have from Louis XIV handing over his helmet and sword, which is really wound up in a tornado of energy, which is the cap of the period that he's painting in. And it's interesting to me, art historically, how once the training started to get more dramatic, to take realism to the height, number one, of depth of field, etc., and then past that height to drama and maybe a little excessive drama, so that you're getting people really emotional and wound up. Art takes off for quite a while, so that you've got the pre-Renaissance, which is more tame, then the Renaissance, and then the 2 or 3 post-Renaissance period where things get really pretty exciting before everybody's like, okay, I think we've gone far enough. We're getting a little crazy here. Particularly to watch it as an art history student when these movements, unlike today, for example, came along one at a time, and you could sort of see the end of one movement coming and the start of the next one. Even as early as 1950, movements start all over the place. And so somebody's working in minimalism and somebody else is working in geometric abstraction. And so you think, okay, anything could happen. This wasn't a time that anything could happen. It all was choreographed to happen in this pattern. And Le Brun was really in the right place at the right time and did a spectacular job.
So for these artists that are doing religious artwork, are they only doing religious artwork, or is that just some of the stuff that's gotten preserved and that we see today?
I think in Le Brun's case, he's really only doing that.
Okay.
And I think that my heart would love me to be able to say that's all he wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I think the truth is he was riding a gravy train in a way. This, as long as he kept doing it and did it in the way that Louis XIV wanted, and as long as Louis XIV stayed alive and stayed in power, he would work forever. So, and I'm sure at his pay scale and getting all these titles and getting appointed to all these things, I'm sure he thought it'd be crazy for me to go out and do somebody else's portrait, or whether they're rich or not, they're still not Louis XIV.
Yeah.
Well, and while his religious work was enormous, they were all commissions. They weren't, as Charles said, they weren't doing these because I feel so moved to do this. They were working, and religious institutions were paying them to make these works to advance the gospel. So that's not wrong. That's not a bad path, but we have to remember that in all of the artists that we've discussed on the show, the church is sponsoring these works of art to be created. Just like King Louis is sponsoring this artist to paint scenes from Alexander the Great's life, or a scene of me lording over my constituents. It's all for an agenda. And in the church's case, I think the agenda was good. In the king's case, not that it wasn't bad, but it was all designed to make the king be preserved in history in a certain light.
Right.
These are the only pictorial depictions that we have of the king, and in every one, he's elevated and flattered and looking wonderful.
Well, and forever. Because these are
Right.
all, I mean, he had to know that these were good enough, they've always be saved. And so we can read what we want about Louis XIV, but when you look at the images, the story is told by what he's commissioned. It also helped position him, I think, better with Rome, because technically Rome still had authority over him, although I think he was trying to show that, yes, we're a Catholic country, and Rome is the head of Catholicism, but the fact is, within this whole structure, I'm a pretty big kingpin. And all these paintings attest to that.
Yeah.
And so Rome's going to endorse Le Brun too. I was like, yeah, good job.
Yeah.
I think that can't be bad for him either.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we've been talking about Charles Le Brun and his art, the stuff that he did for King Louis the 14th. Roman numerals always give me a second. All right. Here from the Fort Wayne Museum of Art with Charles and Amanda Shepard. What's going on with the museum right now?
Well, we have on view a large-scale, sort of immersive, abstract glass sculpture called Repose in Amber that resembles beautiful rose-colored flower petals. Some have said it reminds them of a reclining figure. You decide for yourself. Please come see it. It's unlike anything you've ever seen at the museum.
It's not a simple piece of art.
No.
Very complex.
It's
very intricate.
It's very energetic. It's very intricate, as you say. It's the largest piece of indoor sculpture we've ever had. It's probably the most significant piece of sculpture outside the 20th century that we've ever had. De Souvreau from the 20th century probably would be our most significant. But when you move past the 20th century and you look at some of the sculptures today, Martin being one of the top, probably 8 in the world, you realize we've come a long way since the 20th century. And when Martin got done Friday night, we all went to dinner, and I drove out past the De Souvreau, which I love, but I kind of looked at it like, okay, old friend, and I've never really thought that way about it before, but it was the hippest, biggest thing we ever had, but then again, it happened 30-something, 40-something years ago, so this is what can happen today, and it's testimony to people who believe in this museum who don't even live in this town. The collectors involved are from Chicago. The artist is from Seattle. That everybody wants to see this piece work in Fort Wayne. How exciting is that? Yeah. And a lot of that has to do with what we're doing at the museum, and I think a lot of that has to do with the boom that people see happening in Fort Wayne. I know the 3-person crew from Seattle just kept bopping around all night and all day long. We had lunch here. We had dinner there. We went over this. And that was kind of cool to see. Yeah. And the other funny thing is that none of them were running around asking for a guide to anything. Right. They're like, cool food. Okay, here we go. And they loved everything. So you come down and see it. It's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, check out FWMoA.org and FWMoA on social media for more, or just stop by the museum.
That's
and
right.
Take a tour.
Yeah.
That's right. It'll mean more to you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.